A ruthless mafia boss reduced to agonizing screams, elite doctors paralyzed by fear. It took a heavily underestimated, plus-sized trauma nurse with a pocket scalpel to slice open his transport mattress and uncover the deadly poisoned needles hidden inside. She saved his life. In return, he claimed her soul. The underground medical clinic beneath the desolate streets of Chicago was usually quiet on a Tuesday night. Rosa Coppola preferred it that way. She was a brilliant trauma nurse, sharp-witted, resilient, and deeply compassionate. But the mainstream medical world had been cruel to her. Her beautiful, plus-sized figure had made her the target of endless microaggressions from arrogant surgeons and shallow hospital administrators. Tired of fighting a sterile system that judged the softness of her body before the brilliance of her brain, Rosa took her talents to the shadows. In this clandestine clinic funded by the city's criminal elite, medical skill was the only currency that mattered, and Rosa was undoubtedly the best they had. The heavy metallic doors of the trauma bay blew open, shattering the midnight quiet. Gun-toting men in blood-splattered designer suits swarmed the room, shouting frantic orders and shoving expensive medical equipment aside. In the center of the chaos, being pushed on a custom, reinforced transport stretcher, was Carlo Marino. Carlo was the undisputed king of the Marino Syndicate, a man whose name struck terror from the Rust Belt of Chicago down to the eastern seaboard. He was a ruthless, calculating predator, a man who commanded armies of loyal soldiers. But tonight, he was not a king. He was a man being torn apart from the inside. A guttural, blood-curdling scream ripped from Carlo's throat. His massive, muscular frame writhed in agony, veins bulging against his neck as he strained against the heavy leather restraints his own men had applied to keep him from thrashing off the bed. His dark eyes were rolled back, his handsome face pale and slick with a freezing, unnatural sweat. The clinic's lead physician, a disgraced former neurosurgeon who had lost his license years ago, barked for a dangerously high dose of fentanyl. Rosa moved with practiced, calm efficiency. Her full, curved frame navigated the chaotic room with a quiet grace that always surprised the hardened men who underestimated her. She administered the heavy narcotic directly into Carlo's intravenous line, fully expecting his frantic screaming to subside. It did not. If anything, the sheer agony seemed to amplify. Carlo arched his back violently off the mattress, a horrific sound tearing from his lips, a sound of absolute blinding torture that made the hair on Rosa's arms stand up. The doctors began to panic. They frantically searched for bullet wounds, for hidden stab marks, for any sign of internal bleeding. They found absolutely nothing. Carlo had been found in his own highly secure safe house, thrashing on his bed. His men had simply strapped him to his custom memory foam transport mattress and brought him straight to the clinic. Rosa stood back, her sharp, intelligent eyes scanning the gruesome scene. The fentanyl was entirely useless. This was not a standard physical trauma. This was a targeted, chemical attack on his nervous system. She watched Carlo closely, shutting out the yelling of the mobsters. She noticed a pattern. Every single time his spine made heavy contact with the transport mattress, his screams reached a fever pitch. He was subconsciously trying to escape the bed itself. She stepped forward, forcefully pushing past a heavily armed enforcer twice her size. She placed her soft, steady hands on Carlo's thrashing shoulder. Miraculously, For a fraction of a second, his dark, bloodshot eyes locked onto hers. In that fleeting moment, Rosa saw past the terrifying monster of the underworld and saw a man drowning in a sea of invisible fire. Rosa turned and ordered the men to lift him. The enforcers hesitated, terrified of hurting their volatile boss further. The doctors shouted at her to step back, claiming she was entirely out of her depth. Rosa ignored them all. With a surge of adrenaline and a hidden, stubborn strength she had cultivated over a lifetime of being pushed down, she grabbed Carlo's heavy shoulders herself. She commanded his second-in-command to grab his legs. Shocked by her fierce authority, the mobster obeyed. Together, they hoisted the massive, agonizing man into the air, hovering him just inches above the bloody mattress. Carlo's deafening screams hitched, instantly dialing down to heavy, ragged gasps. Rosa pulled a scalpel from her scrub pocket. She stared at the expensive, blood-soaked fabric of the mattress. Without a second of hesitation, she plunged the sharp blade into the material and ripped it violently open down the middle. The chaotic room went dead silent. Hidden deep within the dense foam layers were hundreds of microscopic, reinforced glass needles. They were clustered in the exact shape of a broad man's back. The incredibly sharp tips were coated in a thick, dark resin. Rosa grabbed a pair of surgical tweezers and pulled one of the hidden needles out, holding it up to the harsh fluorescent light of the trauma bay. It was a highly sophisticated synthetic neurotoxin delivery system. When Carlo had lain down, the microscopic needles pierced his skin invisibly, breaking off inside his flesh and pumping liquid fire directly into his nervous system. The more he moved and thrashed, the deeper the glass shards traveled. She quickly instructed the silent men to lay him on his stomach on a sterilized steel operating table. For the next 4 grueling hours, Rosa stood over the terrifying mafia boss, using heavy surgical magnification to extract over 60 glass shards from his skin. Her lower back ached, her feet throbbed, but her hands never once shook. She worked with an unwavering resilience. When the final microscopic needle was removed and a broad-spectrum antitoxin was administered, Carlo's tense muscles finally relaxed, and he drifted into a peaceful, heavy sleep. The arrogant doctors tried to step in and take the credit, but Carlo's loyal men knew the absolute truth. They looked at the beautiful, chubby nurse with a newfound, terrifying respect. Rosa wiped the sweat from her brow, washed her hands, and clocked out into the cold Chicago night. She thought her brief involvement with the Marino Syndicate was over. She was dead wrong. Exactly a week later, Rosa was forcibly escorted from her modest apartment by 2 giant, silent men in tailored suits. She was driven through the city to a sprawling, heavily fortified estate in the wealthy Gold Coast district. The massive iron gates closed behind her with a dreadful finality. She was led through opulent hallways lined with classic art and armed guards, finally pushed into a massive sunlit bedroom overlooking the choppy gray waters of Lake Michigan. Sitting in a leather armchair, nursing a crystal glass of expensive scotch, was Carlo Marino. He looked entirely different from the sweaty, screaming man on the steel clinic table. He was devastatingly handsome, radiating dark power and a cold, lethal authority. But when his dark eyes landed on Rosa, the coldness vanished instantly. A heavy, suffocating intensity took its place. He tracked her every movement across the room, his dark gaze lingering hungrily on the curve of her hips, the softness of her waist, the defiant tilt of her chin. Carlo stood, moving with the quiet, dangerous grace of an apex predator. He thanked her for saving his life in a voice like gravel and velvet, sliding a heavy leather briefcase across a mahogany desk. It popped open to reveal stacks of $100 bills. It was filled with more cash than Rosa would see in a lifetime of nursing. She looked at the money, then looked him dead in the eye, and bluntly refused it. She told him she was simply doing her job, that her conscience was clear, and she demanded to be taken back home immediately. Carlo laughed, a low, rumbling sound that sent unexpected shivers down her spine. He walked around the deck, his heavy footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. He told her she was not going anywhere. She was now his personal physician, his permanent, live-in nurse. After what happened, he would not trust his life or his body to anyone else. Rosa crossed her arms over her chest, her soft, beautiful features hardening into a fierce glare. She told him she was not a pet to be bought with dirty money and locked in a gilded cage. She fully expected him to lash out, to threaten her life like any other mobster. Instead, Carlo stepped impossibly closer, completely invading her personal space. He reached out, his warm, calloused thumb gently tracing the soft line of her jaw. He confessed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, that since that agonizing night in the clinic, he could not get her out of his head. He had his men investigate her entire life. He knew about the prestigious hospitals that had unjustly rejected her, the arrogant doctors who had cruelly mocked her weight behind her back. Carlo told her they were blind fools who couldn't recognize a goddess when she stood right in front of them. To Carlo, Rosa was absolute perfection. Her lush curves, her brilliant mind, her fearless spirit in a room full of killers. He was deeply, irrevocably obsessed with her. Rosa's heart pounded wildly against her ribs. No man had ever looked at her with such raw, predatory desire and absolute reverence, let alone a man who brutally ruled a criminal empire. She desperately tried to maintain her professional distance, demanding a completely separate wing of the massive estate and strict, non-negotiable working hours. Carlo agreed with a dark smirk, but Rosa knew the boundaries were merely an entertaining game to him, a challenge he was eager to dismantle piece by piece. As Rosa reluctantly settled into her new life, she began to understand the terrifying war she had stepped into. The poisoned needles in the mattress were not a random act of gang violence. They were the intricate work of Victor Blackwood. Victor Blackwood was a charming, highly psychopathic British-American syndicate leader operating out of New York, slowly carving a bloody path into Carlo's Chicago territory. Victor was everything Carlo was not. Where Carlo was brutally direct and fiercely loyal to his people, Victor was a treacherous snake, preferring complex poison, financial sabotage, and psychological warfare over a simple gunfight. Victor had corrupted one of Carlo's most trusted maids, paying her an absolute fortune to swap out the custom mattress in the safe house. The deep-sea neurotoxin was Victor's horrific signature, a slow, agonizing death meant to send a terrifying message to the rest of the Chicago underworld that the Marino Syndicate was weak. When Carlo's men finally tracked down the corrupted maid, Rosa witnessed the true, unfiltered ruthlessness of the man keeping her captive. Carlo did not try to hide his darkness from her. He wanted her to see exactly what kind of monster he was to his enemies. But whenever he returned to the estate from shedding blood, he immediately sought her out, craving her presence like a drug. One evening, a violent thunderstorm rolled over Lake Michigan, rattling the bulletproof windows of the mansion. Rosa was in the estate's massive, dimly lit kitchen, making a cup of chamomile tea to calm her heavily frayed nerves. Carlo walked in, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, smelling sharply of rain, expensive cologne, and fresh gunpowder. He looked utterly exhausted, the heavy weight of the escalating war with Victor Blackwood pressing down on his broad shoulders. Without a single word, Carlo pulled a wooden chair close to hers. He slumped forward and rested his heavy head against her soft stomach, his muscular arms wrapping tightly around her waist. Rosa froze completely, the delicate teacup trembling dangerously in her hands. She knew she should have pushed him away. She should have sternly reminded him of their professional boundaries. But the stark vulnerability of this terrifying, untouchable man completely disarmed her. She tentatively reached out and ran her soft fingers through his thick, dark hair. Carlo let out a long, ragged breath, pulling her even closer, burying his face in the softness of her curves as if she were his only shield against the world. He whispered into her skin that she was his only peace in a life entirely made of chaos and blood. He swore to her a deadly promise that he would burn the entire city of Chicago to ashes before he let Victor Blackwood or anyone else lay a single finger on her. Rosa realized with a sinking, terrifying clarity that she was no longer just his captive nurse. She was his greatest weakness, his ultimate obsession, and his violent reason to slaughter. And God help her, as she held the ruthless Mafia king in her trembling arms, she realized she was starting to fall for the monster. But hundreds of miles away, in a dimly lit, luxurious high-rise in Manhattan, Victor Blackwood was looking at a surveillance photograph on his desk. It was a picture of Rosa, standing outside the underground clinic on the rainy night she saved Carlo's life. A cruel, calculating smile spread across Victor's aristocratic face as he realized the untouchable Carlo Marino had finally found something he was utterly terrified to lose. 3 weeks passed inside the suffocating luxury of the Marino estate. The sprawling Gold Coast mansion had become a fortress of absolute paranoia. Carlo Marino doubled the armed guard patrols, secured the perimeter with military-grade surveillance, and refused to let Rosa Coppola out of his immediate sight. He moved his primary syndicate operations into the estate's massive library, just so he could watch her read by the fireplace while he ordered the dismantling of Victor Blackwood's supply lines. Rosa found herself trapped in a dangerous, intoxicating limbo. She was a woman of science, a pragmatic nurse who had spent her life navigating the harsh realities of underfunded hospitals and cruel societal judgments regarding her lush, heavy figure. Yet here she was, the sole obsession of Chicago's most terrifying predator. Carlo treated her with a dark, suffocating reverence. He worshipped the very ground she walked on, tracing the curves of her hips and the softness of her thighs with a desperate hunger that made her pulse hammer. He made her feel wildly beautiful, untouchable, and deeply powerful. But she was still a prisoner to his violent world. The uneasy peace shattered on a freezing Thursday morning. Rosa had insisted on inspecting a shipment of highly specialized trauma supplies that had been delayed by the escalating gang war. She refused to let Carlo's underground clinics run out of life-saving antibiotics. Reluctantly, Carlo agreed to let her travel to a secure warehouse in the Fulton Market district. But he sent 12 of his most lethal enforcers in a heavily armored motorcade to escort her. He promised he would follow in a second convoy the moment his morning meeting concluded. It was a fatal miscalculation, as Rosa's armored SUV navigated the narrow, brick-lined streets of the meat-packing district. The radio shattered with panicked static. A massive, reinforced industrial garbage truck tore through a red light at 60 miles an hour, T-boning the lead escort vehicle and crushing it into a brick wall. Chaos erupted instantly. Deafening explosions rocked the street as smoke grenades and flashbangs turned the freezing morning air into a blinding grey nightmare. Heavy automatic gunfire rained down from the fire escapes above. Victor Blackwood's mercenaries had set a perfect, highly coordinated ambush. Inside the wildly spinning SUV, Rosa was thrown against the reinforced doors. Her ears rang violently. The driver, a young enforcer she had treated for a bruised rib just days ago, took a heavy caliber round through the reinforced glass. He slumped over the wheel, bleeding profusely from his shoulder. Without a second thought, Rosa's trauma instincts took over. Ignoring the bullets pinging off the armor plating, she crawled over the center console, ripping open her medical bag. She pressed her heavy body weight against his wound, using her soft, strong hands to pack the bleeding artery with sterile gauze. Before she could stabilize him, the heavy rear doors of the SUV were blown off their hinges by a targeted explosive charge. Rough, gloved hands reached into the smoke, violently grabbing Rosa by her hair and shoulders. She fought like a cornered animal, kicking and biting, her fierce survival instincts kicking in. But she was severely outnumbered. She was dragged out of the vehicle, a heavy hood shoved over her head and thrown into the back of a waiting van. When the rough canvas hood was finally yanked off, Rosa blinked against the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights. She was tied securely to a heavy steel chair in the center of an abandoned, freezing meat locker. The smell of old copper and decay hung heavy in the air. Stepping out of the shadows was Victor Blackwood. He looked entirely out of place in the industrial grime, wearing a perfectly tailored bespoke charcoal suit, his silver-streaked hair slicked back. He possessed a sharp, aristocratic face, but his eyes were entirely dead, like a shark swimming in shallow water. Victor slowly circled her, a cruel, mocking smile playing on his thin lips. He looked her up and down, openly judging her plus-sized figure, her practical medical scrubs, and her messy, unruly hair. He clicked his tongue in performative disappointment. He told her he was genuinely baffled. He had expected Carlo Marino to lose his mind over a supermodel, a Russian ballerina, or a high society heiress. He laughed coldly, stating he could not fathom why the ruthless king of Chicago was willing to burn down his entire empire for a plump, ordinary nurse with a stubborn streak. Rosa did not shrink away from his cruel gaze. She had spent a lifetime dealing with arrogant men who thought her weight made her weak or stupid. She lifted her chin, her dark eyes completely and entirely devoid of fear. She looked Victor dead in the face and told him he was a dead man walking. She promised him that when Carlo found him, he was going to beg for a quick death, and Carlo would not give it to him. Victor's smile vanished. He struck her hard across the cheek with the back of his hand. Rosa's head snapped to the side, the metallic taste of blood filling her mouth, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a tear. Regaining his false composure, Victor pulled a long, terrifyingly thick syringe from his breast pocket. The liquid inside was an unnatural, cloudy grey. He explained in a calm, chilling voice that he was not going to kill her. That would be a waste of his greatest leverage. Instead, he injected the cold serum straight into her neck before she could thrash away. Victor explained the poison was a synthetic, hyper-accelerated coagulant. In exactly 2 hours, her blood would begin to thicken into sludge. It would cause a series of agonizing, cascading heart attacks. He placed a small plastic vial containing the clear antidote on a steel table on the other side of the room. He told her he was going to call Carlo right now. Carlo would sign over the entire Chicago port system and all of the Marino Syndicate's offshore financial accounts to Victor. If Carlo agreed, Victor would give her the antidote. If Carlo hesitated, she would die screaming. Victor turned on his heel and walked out of the freezing room, locking the heavy steel door behind him, leaving 2 heavily armed guards to watch her die. What Victor did not realize was that his arrogance was his fatal flaw. To mock her intellect, he had specifically named the synthetic compounds used to create the poison. As the freezing cold of the meat locker seeped into her bones, Rosa's brilliant medical mind raced. She knew the exact chemical makeup of the coagulant. More importantly, she knew that a massive, overwhelming dose of a standard, heavy-duty blood thinner like heparin could chemically bind to the poison and completely neutralize it. She looked at her medical bag, which the mercenaries had carelessly tossed onto the floor near the steel table. She always carried pre-filled heparin syringes for emergency cardiovascular traumas. She just had to reach it. Across the city, Carlo Marino stood in the smoking wreckage of the Fulton Market Street. The rain had started to fall, washing the blood of his men into the storm drains. His expensive black coat was soaked, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying death. When his phone rang and Victor's cultured, smug voice echoed through the speaker, outlining the demands, Carlo did not yell. He did not threaten. His voice was terrifyingly soft, entirely devoid of human emotion. He told Victor he would meet him at the designated warehouse near the river in 30 minutes with the transfer documents. Carlo hung up the phone. He looked at his surviving lieutenants. He ordered them to mobilize every single soldier, sniper, and enforcer in the city of Chicago. They were not going to negotiate. They were going to wipe the Blackwood Syndicate off the face of the earth. Inside the freezing meat locker, Rosa could feel the poison taking effect. Her fingers and toes were growing numb, a heavy, agonizing pressure building tightly in the center of her chest. Her breath plumed in the freezing air. She had to act now. She slumped forward against the heavy ropes, beginning to hyperventilate wildly. She let out a series of ragged, terrifying gasps, her eyes rolling back into her head as she violently thrashed her heavy frame against the steel chair. She played the part of a dying, panicked civilian perfectly. One of the guards, a massive man with a scarred face, laughed cruelly. He walked over, leaning down to mock her suffering, completely underestimating the soft, chubby woman tied to the chair. The moment his face was within striking distance, Rosa's eyes snapped open. Using every ounce of hidden, desperate strength she possessed, she threw her entire body weight backward, tipping the heavy steel chair directly onto the guard's legs. The man screamed as the metal crushed his knees, dropping his rifle. Rosa ignored the blinding pain in her shoulders. She threw her bound hands over the armrest, her fingers desperately blindly grasping a heavy, jagged piece of rusted metal jutting from the broken chair leg. She sawed the thick nylon ropes against the rust with frantic, bloody determination. The rope snapped. She scrambled across the freezing floor, her chest burning with absolute agony as the poison thickened her blood. The second guard raised his weapon, shouting in Russian. Rosa grabbed the heavy plastic medical bag and hurled it directly at his face, throwing off his aim. The bullet grazed her shoulder, but she did not stop. She tackled the guard around the waist, using her heavy, lush curves and low center of gravity to plow the man backward into the steel wall. His head connected with a sickening crunch, and he slumped unconscious. Rosa fell to her knees, gasping for air. Her vision was tunneling into darkness. She ripped open the medical bag, her shaking, bloody fingers finding the plastic casing of the heparin syringe. Without bothering to sanitize the area, she jammed the needle directly through the thick denim of her jeans and into her heavy thigh, depressing the plunger completely. Fire raced through her veins as the heavy blood thinner forcefully clashed with the synthetic poison. She collapsed onto her back on the freezing concrete, staring at the ceiling, waiting to see if her heart would stop or keep beating. A deafening explosion shook the very foundation of the warehouse. The heavy steel doors of the meat locker were blown entirely off their hinges, flying across the room and crushing the unconscious guard. Standing in the smoking threshold was Carlo Marino. He looked like the Grim Reaper incarnate. I was covered in soot and the blood of his enemies, holding a smoking assault rifle in one hand and a heavy tactical pistol in the other. He had slaughtered his way through 50 of Victor's men to reach her. Victor Blackwood stumbled out from a side office, his aristocratic face pale with absolute terror. He had completely underestimated the sheer, apocalyptic violence Carlo was capable of. Seeing his men dead and his empire crumbling in minutes, Victor made a final desperate move. He lunged forward, grabbing Rosa off the floor by her hair. He hauled her against his chest, pulling a heavy silver revolver and pressing the barrel brutally into the soft skin of her temple. Victor screamed, his voice cracking with panic, ordering Carlo to drop his weapons or he would blow her brains out. Carlo froze. The absolute slaughter stopped. He looked at Rosa. He saw the blood dripping down her, the heavy bruising on her cheek, and the tear in her scrub top. A sound escaped Carlo's throat, something between a roar and a wounded animal's cry. His dark eyes were entirely consumed by a violent, protective madness. He slowly dropped his assault rifle to the concrete. He raised his hands, his eyes never leaving Rosa's face. Victor laughed hysterically, thinking he had won. He gloated that the great Carlo Marino was nothing but a weak, pathetic dog who had been brought to his knees by a fat, worthless nurse. Victor did not know the poison had been neutralized. He thought Rosa was weak, dying, and completely helpless. Rosa locked her dark eyes with Carlo's. She gave him a microscopic, deliberate nod. Drawing on the resilience she had built over a lifetime of fighting for respect, Rosa did not cower. She forcefully stomped her heavy, steel-toed work boot directly down onto the arch of Victor's expensive Italian shoe, shattering the delicate bones in his foot. As Victor gasped in pain, Rosa threw her entire body weight violently backward, slamming the soft, heavy curve of her hips and back directly into Victor's chest. The sudden, aggressive impact threw the much lighter man entirely off balance. Victor stumbled backward, his grip on her hair slipping. The heavy silver revolver fired wildly into the ceiling, raining concrete dust down upon them. That single fraction of a second was all Carlo needed. Carlo drew a concealed tactical blade from his belt and threw it with terrifying, mechanical precision. The heavy knife buried itself to the hilt directly in the center of Victor Blackwood's chest. Victor gasped, his eyes going wide with shock. Before Victor even hit the floor, Carlo had closed the distance. He drew a secondary pistol from his ankle holster and put 2 bullets directly into Victor's forehead, ending the gang war instantly. Carlo dropped the gun. He fell to his knees in the blood and the grime, his massive hands frantically checking Rosa's body. He pulled her heavily against his broad chest, wrapping his arms around her lush frame with a desperate, crushing grip. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his broad shoulders shaking as he breathed in her scent, verifying she was real and alive. Rosa wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, burying her fingers in his dark hair. She told him about the poison, about the heparin, assuring him she was safe. She had saved herself. Carlo pulled back, his dark eyes filled with absolute, unfiltered worship. He pressed his forehead against hers, uncaring of the blood and dirt. He swore a violent oath into the freezing air. He told her she was a god among mortals. He promised her that no one would ever underestimate her, hurt her, or take her from him again. She was his heart, his absolute weakness, and his greatest strength. Rosa looked at the terrifying mob boss kneeling in the blood of his enemies, entirely devoted to her. She stopped fighting the dark pull of his world. She realized she did not just want to survive in the shadows, she wanted to rule them by his side. She leaned forward and kissed him fiercely, tasting gunpowder and rain, finally accepting her crown as the undisputed queen of the Merino Syndicate. If you enjoyed this gripping mafia romance drama and want to hear more thrilling stories of dark romance, hidden strength, and high-stakes underworld tension, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your friends. Leave a comment below with your favorite intense moment between Rosa and Carlo, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another heart-pounding underworld tale. Your support helps bring more of these dangerous, passionate stories to life.